Well, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. We've got people from all over the world joining today, except the US. We're doing a US call tomorrow. So thank you so much for joining this, what I think will be a timely call, making sense of 2023 to 2030. This is going to be a brief introduction to making sense of the extremely serious challenges that we face as a globalized civilization. My objective is to expand our perspective on how we think about carbon, climate change, consumerism, corruption, COVID, central bank digital currencies, or the crises of capitalism, or all of them. So we'll simply refer to all of these as the big C's. And this new perspective will guide us to take a conscious, confident, concrete course of action, so that we can navigate what looks to be an immensely turbulent few years until the turn of the decade. So I must warn you that this material is sometimes not easy to get your head around. I know this from the early feedback that I received from friends and colleagues that I've shared with this. This is the first time I'm sharing publicly. So I'm a little nervous, but we'll see how we go. So the content itself is deep and wide, and it can be overwhelming. So I'm going to ask that you allow me to set the full context first, and then we can take questions at the end. The context often matters more than the detail. So feel free to type your questions in as we're going. I won't be able to answer them immediately, but at least there'll be a record of them when we get to question and answers. So I know many of the people on the call. For those I haven't met before, I am a recovering technologist. I helped launch mobile telephony in South Africa way back in 1994. By sheer chance, that project went very well. I was headhunted and then ended up in Sydney, Australia, and ultimately 16 cities on 6 different continents. After a life-changing event that happened in Southeast Asia, I then changed direction completely and spent 15 years as a systemic change advisor. Systemic change is that field of research where people are looking at the overall system that causes the individual challenges within society, and they're asking the question, can anything be done to change that system? So as a result of all of that time, I call myself an optimistic collapsologist. Collapsologist because I'm pretty sure that we are experiencing collapse, and that's what the rest of this talk will be about. But I'm optimistic because there are some good signs, good news on the horizons. Okay, so the reason I've put this webinar together is fairly simple. After spending 15 years in that systemic change space, I've seen lots of people working on proposing and inspiring solutions. That's the good news. The bad news is that these simple solutions just won't cut it. The majority of people working on solutions have their heart in the right place, the best intentions, but they simply haven't taken into account how bad things really are. There's a general naivety, and I say that cautiously and advisedly because I've got many friends in this space. But that's why I'm doing this webinar, to help us expand our perspective about where we're at. So with your permission, I'm going to be fairly direct, and I'm not going to sugarcoat or engage in any kind of greenwashing. I do take this stuff very, very seriously, because once you've stared into the abyss, you cannot unsee what you've seen. Now, sometimes emotional reactions to this material can range from denial to anger to anxiety, but I want to be very clear. The purpose of this material is to give you a sense of clarity and a sense of hope and even a sense of joy. So let's dive in. So to begin, we must acknowledge that the ecological and economic and social systems that underpin our world, they're all going through a profound transformation, and why this is happening will become clear. But what we don't need is another 100 statistics about what our situation is like, and I promise I'm not going to share any of that. Instead, we need a lens through which to view what's happening. So one such lens is the patterns and cycles that repeat themselves throughout history. And by analyzing these patterns, we can gain a deeper understanding of our place in the world. Our leaders certainly aren't providing this understanding, and that's why it's up to us to make sense of it all. One immensely valuable lens is known as social cycle theory. And that's a theory that tells us that each civilization goes through a distinct cycle that consists of 7 phases. And each phase has its own very specific characteristics. And by knowing what to look for in each phase, we can identify where in that cycle we find ourselves. And when we know where we are, then it helps us anticipate what comes next. Now, it normally takes me upwards of an hour to explain all of these phases and the phases that our global civilization has followed. It's the first time that a civilization isn't geographically contained. It is now global. I have included a handout in an email that you would have received, but we'll also share a handout of this where there's a lot more detail if you're interested in the detail. But for today, I'm going to simply ask that you accept that there's ample evidence that we are simultaneously witnessing characteristics of phase 7 and phase 0. Phase 7 is collapse and phase 0 is emergence. So something is dying and something is emerging. We'll get into a bit more detail. In other words, we're experiencing a major, irreversible, inevitable societal transition. And that's probably the key message I want to leave today. And accepting this fact can be challenging. And that's because accepting it also means that there's nothing that we can do to fix the system, because the system itself is beyond its sell-by date. But once we can accept that reality, we can stop reacting and shift our focus to what role we can play in whatever comes next. Now, rather than covering all of the characteristics of each of the phases, there are 3 important ones that I want to highlight, and they are all hallmarks of phases 6 and 7. In other words, history tells us that we must expect these kind of characteristics in a late-stage civilization. Let's have a look at them. So the first is a rise of hubris and totalitarianism. Hubris is extreme pride, and it's usually in the 1% or the elite class. Now, when I use a phrase like that, I'm not being accusatory or condemning or anything like that. The 1% or the elite class is a natural outcome of a class-based system. It has repeated over and over again in history, so the system itself is working as designed. Now, the reason we get a rise of hubris and totalitarianism is because the elite class becomes increasingly determined to defend their wealth and their position in society from the marauding masses. So one example of this was during the pseudo-pandemic. We saw that many restrictions were brutally enforced in some countries. That's the signs of totalitarianism emerging. A second characteristic is censorship and propaganda, to the point that it's difficult to actually know what's going on, what reality is anymore. So during the pseudo-pandemic, there was wide-scale suppression of scientific and medical discourse in favor of the mainstream version of what was happening. And then also, as far as climate is concerned, there are hundreds of credible scientists proclaiming as loudly as they can that real science doesn't support the mainstream climate narrative. But of course, they're ignored, vilified, and ostracized. And we'll see why that happens and how it's happened before in history. So one example of this is if you've seen Tucker Carlson and Naomi Wolf's recent commentary about the January 6th insurrection, you'll know just how deep these lies run. But the point is that now is the time when lies are slowly exposed. And this is what happens during late stage collapse. It's also what causes the elite class to become more hubristic and more totalitarianism as they try and defend their positions. So the third characteristic is heresy, or the banning of intelligent discussion and debate. So heresy is any belief or theory that is strongly at variance with established or enforced beliefs or customs. So in other words, if I'm a climate change denier, then I'm accused of heretical thinking. Now, between the 1400s and 1800s, anyone who was found guilty of heresy was burned at the stake. And some, like Galileo Galilei, Francis Bacon, William Harvey, René Descartes, and many others were accused of heresy, but they were never sentenced. The irony is that many of their ideas proved in time to be accurate. So their crimes were not that their beliefs were false. It was simply daring to challenge the dictates of the church. And the church did not like debate or discussion at all. So today, anyone who challenges the dictates of those who fly into Davos every year are ridiculed and figuratively burned at the stake. So just ask any of the hundreds of doctors who loudly question the pseudo-pandemic and the hundreds of scientists questioning the current climate narrative. So even Donald Trump was burned at the stake for withdrawing from the World Health Organization in May of 2020. But in 2023, a growing number of concerned doctors, scientists, academics, and policy wonks are similarly calling for the same withdrawal from the World Health Organization. That's just an idea of how initially different thinking is called heretical and then it's accepted. So my point is that we must be very careful of immediately dismissing ideas that challenge the status quo. It's these ideas that form the very basis of progress, particularly during times of social transition like these. So as a summary, the three insidious characteristics: hubris, which is excessive pride or self-confidence. It's a common characteristic of the elite class, and it's particularly insidious when combined with totalitarianism. And then censorship and propaganda. So climate propaganda is being used to achieve total control, and we'll get into why I say that. And then the banning of discourse. So healthy debate and discussion is a sign of a vibrant society. But when dissent is met with force, it's a clear sign that that society is close to collapse. So let's now look at three important lessons that we've learned from previous collapses and transitions. The first is that collapse of the old does not mean extinction. It simply means a transition from one set of organizing principles to another. And the new set of organizing principles always starts with autonomy, independence, and sovereignty as key values to strive for. So if we think about the American Revolution, they broke free from the British monarchy. They wanted to do things their own way, write their own constitution. They no longer wanted to be under the control of the monarchy. And over time, these values slowly shift from independence back to dependence. And we'll see what I mean by that later. So the second lesson is that collapse only occurs in class-based societies. And a class-based society is anything that's built on a division of labor. Division of labor extrapolated ends up in the 1% challenge. Now, an alternative is a values-based society, and these don't collapse unless they're wiped out by natural disasters or by other class-based societies. The oldest living values-based participatory democracy on earth is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of North America, and then the longest surviving values-based clan is the Khoisan tribes of South Africa. So while neither of these two have written history, their organizing principles have been fairly well researched, and they might act as some examples for us. Then the third lesson is that as society transitions from the old to the new, the relative ease or discomfort of the transition, the turbulence of the transition, is determined by how healthy the value flow is from one system to the next. So generally speaking, those at the top of the pyramid want to impede the flow. They want to retain all that value within the system that is busy collapsing. But those at the bottom of the pyramid are the ones that are wanting to accelerate the flow. So there's this tension of value flow. So let's now look at three possible scenarios that previous transitions have faced. The first is a massive slide backwards if our global supply chain and economy fail entirely. And that's not as unlikely as it sounds. We've seen various disruptions already. So in our case, if we were to regress, we'd go back to hunter-gatherer societies. And obviously that's not an outcome that we want. The second potential scenario is a version of George Orwell's 1984, which is embodied in forms of oppressive, manipulative, totalitarian governments, or even a single world government that's just as oppressive. So if you're paying attention to what's going on, you will know that those who fly into Davos every year, they're pushing very hard for the second scenario. And they're in a race against time before scenario one plays out by default. They know how fragile the system is. So they believe they must accomplish this, in other words, scenario two. Otherwise, their wealth and lifestyles could be severely compromised by the marauding masses. But there's a third scenario, which is obviously my preference, and that's the emergence of a higher tier approach to business and society. And that approach would be fundamentally different from one we know today, and even unknown from what we know. So let's look at an example of where these three different scenarios play out, and we'll use the Roman and Byzantine empires. Because if we can understand these three scenarios, it'll help us make sense of the coming years. We can't make any specific predictions or outcomes, but we can keep our eyes peeled for evidence that either one of these three scenarios are playing out. And that's how we make sense of the next coming years. So let's look at the Roman and Byzantine empires between 395 AD and 1453. And rather than looking at the land mass that the empires covered, let's look at the merchant routes, the trade routes that kept the land empire successful. And trade routes during this time were mainly centered around the Mediterranean Sea. And it was incredibly healthy. Rome was a thriving empire. But as the dogma imposed by the Roman Catholic Church became more and more unbearable, a group of merchants decided to reject those outdated beliefs of the Romans, and they decided instead to open up a new playground in the Baltic Sea. And they became known as the Hanseatic League, and they dominated commercial activity in those northern seas from about the 13th to the 15th century. In other words, as the Byzantine Empire was slowly collapsing, they came into strength. Now, they were so well organized and so successful that value flowed healthily from the Mediterranean to the Baltic as the Roman and Byzantine empires collapsed. So in this case, the Byzantine Empire experienced a regression. That was scenario number one. And Northern Europe experienced a momentous leap, which is scenario number three. And the environment that the Hanseatic League created was so stimulating that it enabled new ideas to flourish and ultimately led to the European Renaissance, which was a huge burst in creativity and flourishing. So it was in this playground that the foundations for our existing civilization were laid. And this new playground enabled a gradual shift towards a more secular and scientific worldview. They broke away from the religious doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, speaking of worldviews, it's not uncommon that during periods of these societal transitions, that the dominant view of humans and their role in the world is shaken to the core and sometimes completely upended. So the dominant worldview during the Roman Empire was undoubtedly religious in nature. But it was upended in favor of the scientific revolution, which led to the dominant worldview today, which is a mechanistic and materialistic in nature. And part of what we're witnessing today is an upending of that same scientific worldview. And just as the Roman Catholic Church tried to suppress their shift, there are some today who want to suppress this shift away from the idea of a technocracy. Okay, let's pause and take a deep breath for a moment. There was a ton of content, but why is it necessary to take this jaunt through history? Well, it's necessary for the next three seemingly heretical claims that I'm going to make. And believe me, I don't make these claims lightly. I know there's a good chance I'll be burned at the stake. Ready? Let's go. Okay, so heresy number one, there is no climate emergency. The biggest risk we face related to climate is mis- and disinformation, and more specifically, how we're being emotionally manipulated and by mainstream media. So it's certainly true that we are engaged in ecocide, But focusing on carbon sequestration and maintaining warming to 1.5 degrees, that's just a distraction from the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is that the entire system is past its sell-by date. So what this means is that any time spent debating the climate is wasted time. Any and all climate solutions, in inverted commas, are fundamentally flawed. The climate is simply being used to keep us fearful. And that leads me on to the next heretical claim. So the biggest risk we face is totalitarianism. History shows us that those who reach the top of the pyramid end up with insane solutions or excuses to defend and maintain their position in society. So we must expect this. The pseudo-pandemic was merely a test of how susceptible each nation's citizens are to fear-mongering under the guise of disease. And the next phase is to do the same under the guise of climate. So if you've got any doubts about this, look into the working group on amendments to the international health regulations. So this is basically using the World Health Organization and enabling them to impose any kind of restrictions on any nation without notice, including under the guise of climate change. And then the third heresy or heretical idea is that the search for solutions within a collapsing system is counterproductive. So I've spent 15 years searching for solutions, and there is a plethora of really cool initiatives. And however, they all have unintended consequences, and not a single one of them come close to transitioning us away from a debt-based economic system. And many would argue that a debt-based economic system is the root cause of our challenges because of the requirement for constant growth. And we know that perpetual growth with limited resources is unmaintainable. So in short, we're well and truly screwed. Now, if you're paying attention at the beginning, you'll have heard me say that the purpose of this material is to give you a sense of clarity and a sense of hope and even a sense of joy. So where is the joy in all of this? Well, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked. But before I answer, I'm going to ask one huge favor. I'd like to get a sense of how much of a true environmentalist each of us are on the call. So in the next 10 seconds or so, quickly scan the room that you're in and count how many green objects you can see, however you define green. It can be the color green or something that preserves the environment. And then just make a mental note of it, and we'll see who's able to spot more than 10 green items. Okay, 10 seconds, let's go. Finished? Fabulous. Okay, now a question. Who can tell me how many red objects they saw? Okay, I'm being intentionally unfair. I intentionally and easily distracted you from seeing the red elephant. And this is exactly what mainstream media does all the time. So the only point I want to make with this is that where we focus matters, and it matters a lot. So for the next few minutes, as we reach the end of this part of the presentation and we open up for questions, I'm going to ask you just for a moment to wipe any ideas or memories of the big C's. Pretend that they don't exist at all. In fact, we can do better yet. Imagine two entirely different board games sitting next to each other. Maybe one is Monopoly and one is Scrabble. Each game has completely different rules and objectives. Now imagine placing all of your big C concerns on the Monopoly board and then push it to one side for a moment. Now shift your attention to the other board game. But the only thing is, this time, while you weren't watching, it morphed from a game of Scrabble into a game you've never seen before. You're completely unfamiliar with the rules or even the objective of the game. But there's something immediately appealing about it. It looks different. Now imagine all of the value that was created in your Monopoly game being transferred into the new board game. So all those properties, houses, hotels, all the cash that you accumulated during the game. But as you move it across, this value changes form. and it turns into something completely different, something which can't easily be described. You can see in that game on the left-hand side, it's not clear what those cards mean. But what we do know is that this value is infinitely more appealing and meaningful than the value we were playing with in the Monopoly game. You have the sense that something magical can be accomplished with this new game, even though you can't quite describe what it is. You can't quite put your finger on it. So that's exactly what happened with the Hanseatic League as they broke free from Rome and created that new playground up in the north. They didn't know exactly what to expect, but they did everything that they could to promote healthy value flows into their new game, into their new playground. And remember that at the time, Europe and Scandinavia were not in a good shape. There'd been more than 100 years of brutal wars. So there was no immediate reason for people to be interested in the region. But they got to work and regenerated everything. So the Hanseatic League started by helping to negotiate the Peace of Westphalia, which was signed in October 1648. That treaty brought peace to the entire Holy Roman Empire, and it closed a calamitous period of European history that killed approximately 8 million people. The peace enabled the rebuilding of Europe, and their playground became so successful, as we said earlier, that it eventually led to the European Enlightenment and Renaissance. So that's the focus I'm suggesting we should embrace as we consider societal collapse and transition, that we should be focusing on how to create healthy value flows out of the old that's busy collapsing and into the new. Now, in a few minutes, I'll give a few examples of how this could work, but let me stop and see if there are any questions so far. I know we've covered a huge amount, so thank you for sticking with me. It can be heavy going.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Hope I'm audible.
Yes, perfect.
Okay. So my question is that from what I've realized so far, the only part that has not yet been taken by force yet is property. So property currently is something which hasn't been taken by force as yet. So could we not, as people who are trying to battle the totalitarian, it's hard to pronounce the word, but we're trying to battle the totalitarianism. So couldn't we focus on property?
So firstly, you're reading my mind, and in the second part of the presentation, you'll see how we talk exactly about 6 capitals, and land is one of those capitals. Rather than, I think you said changing ownership, we talk about stewardship, but absolutely very much thinking along the same lines. It's not easy, and what we're finding is that there are ways of doing it. So thank you for that, Namatai. Great question. I don't see any other hands, so I'm going to go to text quickly. Somebody is asking about hope of good governance, specifically in South Africa, and whether it's better to remain here or to move elsewhere. I think the key for me is that we are very much in a global civilization. So although we're currently looking at individual countries, we still tend to have that kind of viewpoint because that's how we've been brought up. Escaping from South Africa or escaping from any other country going elsewhere is you'll pretty much find yourself within the same system. So the question of governance is a good one. But what happens in a class-based society is that your systems, including systems of governance, become so complex and so difficult to change and so burdensome and so bureaucratic that eventually the entire system collapses under its own weight. And now we've got the track record of history to show us that. So it's not, there's nothing conspiratorial about that viewpoint at all. It's just, that's what we've seen. That's exactly what happened to Rome. And it's the same as what will happen in South Africa, same as what will happen in the US and every other major country in the world, provided we can recognize this need to create healthy value flows from one system into another. Terry, good morning. Nice to see you. You've got your hand raised. Do you want to unmute yourself and go ahead?
No, my question is that I think there is an incredible display of context, because there is no understanding with that context. That is a law. The second thing that I believe is a question is that we have not put the context about the evolution of what makes us human, which is our brain, our intelligence, our cognitive ability faculties, and our consciousness. That's one of the aspects that I wanted to question about, to include it or to make a contextual sort of, as well as you've done with the rest. If we could make not now, but in the future, if we develop a context about the human ability to evolve.
Yes, you did. Thank you very much, Terry. So if you think back to the third scenario, which is the momentous leap, that momentous leap cannot happen without a significant jump up in consciousness. Now, fortunately, there's plenty of evidence of that happening anyway. What appears to be happening, though, is these pockets of consciousness that are rising up and recognizing the need to do something different. At the moment, they're still pretty separate, and they're operating in little groups, little communities. So the next thing I believe that will happen is those pockets of consciousness that have raised will now find themselves joining together, and our collective consciousness will take a leap forward. So that's one of the reasons why I'm fairly confident that this will happen anyway. The signs out there are significant that is happening. There's many, many initiatives around the world, many conversations going on around or similar to what we're doing today, but they are separate. And when they start coming together, then we'll see some big things happening. Elber is asking, Bitcoin is the first and only non-manipulatable self-protective asset ledger. That's a lot of words there, but essentially what Elber is saying is that it's very different to our current forms of currency and so on. The only challenge I see with Bitcoin is that they've ended up, if you compare what was written in the original white paper and to where Bitcoin has ended up today, is that they've repeated many of the design flaws that we see in a debt-based, although Bitcoin is not debt-based, it is creating the 1% problem. In other words, all the people that got on board early, who were able to purchase computing power and so on, became immensely wealthy. And so it created class systems within Bitcoin. Now, that doesn't mean that Bitcoin itself is a bad thing for humanity or our consciousness. What it did do is drop something into the ocean of consciousness, saying that we are able to create our own currency. Prior to Bitcoin, those ideas didn't exist at all, and specifically digital currency. So there's all sorts of good things that have come about as a result of Bitcoin, more specifically blockchain, which is the underlying technology that makes Bitcoin possible. But yes, generally I would agree with what Elber is saying. Ilko, are you there? Do you want to come off mute?
Yeah, I'm just, listening carefully to you, not so much a question, but two sort of points that sort of resonated with me, struck my mind, are basically that the real crisis that we're facing is a crisis of leadership, which is sort of perennial throughout history. So then the ensuing question is, how are we going to tackle or address that issue, bearing in mind that that's point number two, that you're absolutely right. There's no point in exploring solution when the system is collapsing. You need a radical reboot, so to speak. So not leadership, how are we going to tackle the leadership issue, not from a solutions perspective, but from an opportunity perspective. So more of a sort of suggestion than an question for me. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ilko. And I couldn't agree more. Now, a point to add to on that is that very often the temptation is to look for leaders within the existing system. So vote out this party and vote in this one, and then everything is going to change. But I think what we're learning is that it's the system itself. It's not the parties that make any difference. So the key thing that's different here about our view of leadership is that it's the next generation. And how do we prepare that next generation? How do we show them that a new system is what they must bootstrap up, pull up literally from the ground up? So it's a complex thing, but love the angle of your question. Fabulous. Thank you, Ilko. Buzz, do you want to go ahead? Good to see you.
Hi, Michael. Thanks very much. I really appreciate how you've gone about it, and I have a much better understanding of our history and how we got to where we got today. And I'm really now looking forward to what it is we should be doing that would be effective towards a desired future.
You ask very simple, easy to answer questions.
Good.
In the second part of this presentation, I'm going to go into showing examples of what we're doing in various parts in South Africa that will give an idea. There's no right way to do this. There's no 100% foolproof solution. Much the same as the Hanseatic League didn't really know how. They had an idea, they had some principles, they had a North Star that they were heading towards, and that's similar to what we should be doing here. I don't believe there is one single solution, but the overriding principle is to create value flow out of this thing into this thing. And to the extent that we can get that right is the extent that we're going to avoid some pain.
Thank you.
Adrian, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So, Michael, 12 months ago in Canberra, there was probably the biggest rally ever in Australia. I was there for 2 weeks myself. I'd estimate probably 700,000 or 800,000 people, which is about 7 or 8% of the adult population. It was a wonderful collective of people energy. Unfortunately, the ego leaders it failed. I just would like your opinion on those mass demonstrations, and also how can we better that we did last year in terms of that collective and finding that leadership?
Great question. So firstly, Australia is very close to my heart. I have a lot of friends who were there during what were brutal lockdowns, specifically down in Victoria, but I'm pretty sure all the other states as well. So as far as protests are concerned, I believe the only thing that they're good at is raising visibility and making aware that something is seriously wrong. So I think we've done that now, and globally. I mean, there were plenty of protests all over the planet. So there's an awareness in the general consciousness that something is wrong. But now we need to move into the next phase. So if you view protests as a way of saying, stop doing whatever we're doing, and then it gives you a chance to reset and think about what a reset might be. But the next phase is to go. And this is now where we roll up our sleeves, get hands into the soil or the equivalent, and do something. Protests will still continue, but I think it's up to people who are able to have this kind of conversation to recognize that attending another protest isn't going to accomplish any more than what it has already. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Yep.
Oh, thank you. Matt Perkis, good to see you. Do you want to come off mute?
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, Michael, thanks very much for putting that in a very appropriate context for us all. I think you've been hard at work in the back there, but just a question around collaboration, right? Because, I mean, the capitalistic system has really entrenched this individual nature, almost like the most ruthless will survive. And it's the antithesis of where we need to go, right? As a regenerative society where it is about collaboration. And the example that I used in the chat box is living in community or an eco-village requires a certain mindset that isn't really inculcated in our society today. So with systems like holacracy and cooperative governance, my main question is that how do we get this information across to the people as quickly as possible so we can transition from a space of individualistic extraction to a place of collaborative regeneration?
Again, not an easy question to answer, but thanks for the question, Matt. So if we go back to this idea of autonomy, it literally is up to us. So firstly, put aside any ideas or thinking that our leadership is going to help us achieve what you've just asked. So the road ahead is not easy for us. How do we get people on board this way of thinking? By having more of these conversations, by being brave and courageous and stepping out and saying some things that need to be said. It's not easy, but I don't see any other way of doing it. And at the same time, to maintain hope and know that what is happening at the consciousness level is that more and more people are becoming ready for these kind of conversations. Do I have evidence of that? No. but it's very much in the zeitgeist. Maybe it's just the space that I'm spending time in, but there is a hope. And actually, this has been going on for many years now. There have been people working in this space. Intentional communities are more than 50 years old. It's a case now of how we roll it out to a wider audience. And if anyone has bright ideas on how to do that, we're all ears. Thierry, you want to ask another question? And then we'll take one more from chat.
That other question is actually a question linked to what Adrian is talking about mass happening or mass events. And I'm asking a question about the quality or the type of these mass events. For example, you can see that certain concerts have changed the course of history, you know, like Bob Marley, for example. I mean, this guy's just changed lots of things in many things. And for example, in France now, it's not just because I'm following very closely the yellow jacket, you know, the type of thing like this. What I wanted to say to Adrian, it is the intent of that event. And I'm asking Michael about the power of intent of making any action towards the hope is very, very important. And this is why Adrian was saying that thing was hijacked by egos, is because they intent overpower the intent maybe of the group that was having something. So my question is, how do we work out about that individual or group of individuals and collective intent that serves the journey that you are putting forward in a third category, which is the jumping leap things. That's my question about the intent. How do you pick the intent, or I don't know?
Yeah. So the key is to take a step forward. If you think back to the Hanseatic League, there was no clear idea of what they were doing. They set an intent, and then some merchant went out and started negotiating with the various cities that formed the new hubs in their trade routes. So I think that's what we need to do, is establish nodes. And in the second part of the presentation, which we'll get onto in about a minute or two, I can show you some examples of how we're doing that. And Thierry, you yourself in Wolseley are doing something similar. So the point is to find these initiatives and get involved in them in some way, even though the outcome may not be clear. For me, the important bit is holding clear this notion of creating a healthy value flow from one to the other. In the next bit, as I mentioned, I'll talk about the 6 capitals and give some examples around that. But to sit with people who you find yourself in community with and figure out which of the capitals are most appealing to you, and then come up with some kind of strategy and make it happen. In the process of starting the journey, coincidences happen, the right people come along. I know many of the people on this call have experienced that. Okay, Derek has just typed a fairly long text in, which I haven't had a chance to read, but it seems to make sense to me, specifically about creating a values-driven society and approach.
Good to see you, Michael.
Hi.
Yeah, so look, the point I'm making is just, you know, it's we have to be very careful with throwing the baby out with the bathwater. When you had these transitions, like you said, there's turbulence in transitions. If you don't want to end up with a Venezuela type situation covering most of the planet, you have to be very, very careful how things change. And that's, I think, is a day-to-day experience that everybody's going to go through. I don't think, you know, any sort of radical measures like land grabs and so forth in South Africa or anywhere else in the world, for that matter, will work. They don't. It'll end up in regression or repression. Simple as that.
Yep.
The forward leaps that we're looking at, Bitcoin was very important. I believe it was a crucial part of our evolution, because whatever people have to say about it, I see somebody comment there that it's a Ponzi scheme. It's not the point. The solution that Bitcoin was solving was the double spend problem on the internet. And by happenstance, it happened to also create this thing for transparency where people are able to do things on a network that can be verified. And if you start linking blockchain into every aspect of governance, be it for government or companies or human endeavor, you create the opportunity for people to embed transparency in what they do. So that for me is a crucial piece of technology that we really require as a species. The other thing is what we're starting to see as a result of, fallacious or not, climate change initiatives is a very, very big push towards energy sources and ways of creating energy. And a lot of them, I agree with you, are highly manipulative. They're there to perpetuate the current status quo of oil companies, the powers that be, and so forth, which again, being a decentralist, I always look at whether things centralized or not centralized. The solution is to have the equivalent of solar panels on everybody's house, and not have centralized power generation and distribution. But I digress. The point is, if we end up with cheap and nearly free energy, everything is derived from energy, whether it's our food or manufacturing of goods, etc., etc. So the cost of everything that we bear in our lives ultimately comes from energy. If we have free energy, everything that we produce and eat and the way we live our lives effectively becomes free or nearly free. So the basis of greed goes away. That's what we're trying to eliminate. It's one of the biggest problems that we have as a species, is individual greed. So those are the two things that I see are key to a good transition.
Yes. Fabulous. Thank you. Couldn't agree more. And as far as energy is concerned, the key thing there is to link energy with autonomy. In other words, if we hand over responsibility for our energy, then we end up in the situation that we're in now. Okay, so thanks for those questions. So moving on to part two quickly. Earlier I said that I'd give some of concrete examples of how creating healthy value flows out of the old into the new. Now, first, as you've seen from the questions, it's worth saying that this is a huge topic and I can only scratch the surface in the little bit of time that's available to us. So second, I believe that I may have created a little bit of cognitive dissonance in your mind. And some of the ideas, certainly for some of you at least, may have rattled you because it may be the first time that it's dawning on you that we are facing a collapse. And if that's true, then where does it leave you? What do you do about yourself and your family? How do you prepare? But I don't mean this from a survivalist perspective, stocking up long life food and so on. I remember that collapse doesn't equal the end. It's the end of a certain way of organizing society, but it's not death and destruction, although there may be some of that as well. I mean that question, what does it mean for you, from more of an existential perspective. So have you given much thought to why did your soul choose to come to earth at precisely this time? Couldn't it have chosen an easier time to be alive at? And then what role are you meant to play, or what should you do? What's the most intelligent way of responding to the situation? So these are some of the questions I've grappled with for many years for myself, because I know that our grand purpose has nothing to do with recycling or using less water or reducing our carbon footprint. Our purpose, I sense, is much bigger than that. So I need to let you in on a little secret. Everyone who's on this call responded to an invitation that was written in a very specific manner, and it was written to carefully filter out most people, filter out those who think that everything is hunky-dory. So the very fact that you're here means that you're already asking these deep questions. You're questioning existential things like, what is our collective purpose? And why are you personally right here, right now? Is it just chance, or is there a guiding power that brought us here? And what legacy do you want to leave in the face of this kind of collapse and transition? Do you want to be remembered for what's fading away or for what's emerging? So the good news is that the size of what's emerging is significantly bigger than what we might believe. The only thing is mainstream media doesn't ever talk about it. And so it's just up to us to have these individual conversations to give a sense of what's already there. But people, as I said, have been working on this since the 1970s. That's more than 50 years already. And there are thousands of really interesting initiatives. But like I said, they're all siloed. And now I think the next challenge is to bring them together into some meaningful construct of some sorts. But it's one of the reasons I'm optimistic, because we already have all of the puzzle pieces. We don't have to build anything new. Blockchain is there. Various crypto things are there. What blockchain brought is triple entry accounting. And the last time we had a big breakthrough in accounting was double entry accounting, which happened during the Renaissance. It was the Venetians who created this entirely new form of accounting, and that enabled this huge leap forward. And blockchain did the same thing, that accountability and visibility. So I want to just quickly give you some concrete examples of what we're working on. I'm not suggesting that there's anything 100% correct here. It's just our version of it. There's many other versions around the world, but I thought it might be helpful just to give a few examples. And remembering that the big question is how we create healthy value flow from what is ending into what is emerging, rather than addressing any of the other noise that we see. So here in South Africa, we started off by asking which of the 6 capitals can be transferred out of the existing system. And here's just some examples. So land trusts, we found a way of moving land out of the real estate market and into a land trust that's owned by the community. And our first question that came was very much around this. So we're looking at faith-based land, in other words, land owned by various churches and so on, indigenous land, and then land that's been abandoned by the state, and then moving these firstly out of the existing system into a land trust. As far as human capital is concerned, we're inspiring some of the unemployed to take accountability and then to get involved in some activities that aren't currently rewarded by the capitalist system. So some of the things we're considering is biochar, regenerating the soil, and then looking at industrial hemp and other biofuel type crops. So again, lots of different initiatives and examples, but the point is to do that on land trust that's taken out of the existing system. So social capital, we're inspiring communities to come up with new origin stories. An origin story answers the question about why are we here and what's our purpose and how should we live? And you'll see that none of these approaches have anything to do with climate change or pollution or anything like that. It's thinking differently about how we live on the land. As far as manufactured capital is concerned, we're restoring and putting back to work machinery and equipment that has lain unused for many years. So one that I'm particularly excited about is a water mill that was built in the 1860s here in the valley where we live. And we're finding ways to restore that. Financial capital is the one that's most interesting to me, because it's how do we create value flow from, let's call it the fiat system, into some other system. So we're considering circular economies with our own token. And then this is what I'm excited about, is creating an NFT which allows you access to stewardship of that land that's in land trust rather than ownership. So thinking very differently about how we allocate access to something. And then incentive capital is an exciting one, because what we're doing here is exploring using the health of the soil as the commodity that backs a token. So where gold used to back the dollar, we're now looking at healthy soil. In other words, as the soil health improves, the currency improves. So this is a huge disincentive for current agricultural practices like plowing and fertilizer and so on. I just wanted to very quickly give some ideas. There's hundreds and thousands of other examples emerging around the world. But hopefully these examples are useful to you. You can see that not one of the initiatives are directly linked to any of the big C's. And none of them can be classified as any kind of solution. Rather, it's a way of thinking about these value flows and how we flow from one to the other. And they all have a common theme, which is removing or reducing dependence on a system that no longer serves us. So I'm not a huge fan of Jordan Peterson, but he recently said, and I love this, here's the basic rule. All the responsibility you abdicate will be taken up by tyrants. So that's your energy that we were talking about earlier with Derek. It's your water provision, it's your food. We've abdicated all of that responsibility and it's been taken up by tyrants. That seems to be the process of what happens in a class-based society. And that's what Peterson says. That's the cardinal rule of social organization. He didn't say in a class-based society, but I think that bit's important. So that's what's happened, and that should be our focus, is taking back accountability and responsibility wherever we've abdicated them, and establishing communities, establishing groups of people that have that as their primary driver, taking back the accountabilities that have been abdicated by others. Okay, we've covered a huge amount, and I hope I've managed to expand your perspective on how we think about the big C's. And as we wrap up, I'd again like to challenge you what you think your role might be in creating these value flows, rather than worrying about any of those big C's there. I may have painted a pretty bleak picture, and the reality is that things are generally a lot worse than what most change agents recognize. It's certainly much worse than a 1.5 degree change in temperature. So how do we navigate this transition? Well, I'm going to do a little bit of a punt now, because I've put together a unique program that you might find useful. It's called Your Unique Self Roadmap, and it's the quickest path of understanding why me and why now. It's definitely not a survivalist course, but it does help you becoming proactive in defining and building the future that we all want. So it's a 14-day program, and by the end of it, you'll have absolute clarity on why the universe has placed you here during these unprecedented times. The program itself is based on a far more in-depth 90-day program, which is geared for high net worth individuals to help them think differently about their wealth and how to shift wealth from this system into this system. And because they're so trapped in their thinking, it takes a little bit longer with a high net worth individual. It's also going to be used for companies that, rather than messing around with ESG scores and greenwashing, this is a real way of shifting value out of this system into this system. And the program for these high net worth individuals and companies is typically around $5,000 to $15,000. But the cost for this one, Your Unique Self Roadmap, is a tiny fraction of that. So I hope you'll check it out. And this is the first time I'm running it in this format. So I'm presenting it in a beta format, and I'm going to be giving a crazy amount of value so that you can test something new with me. You will be taking a bit of a risk on investing your time. I'm not 100% sure what the results are going to be. So I'm going to bend over backwards to give you far more than I'll offer in any future programs. All I ask in exchange is that you consider becoming a case study or a testimonial. So the details, you can find it at lifelegacyai.com/beta. And that's all I've got. So we went a little bit over time, but thank you very much for joining us. I hope it expanded your perspective of what's going on in the world a little bit more, and more specifically, what you can do using your gifts, your experience, your talent, your network to help create these healthy value flows. So thanks again for spending time with us. I'm going to stop the recording now, but I'm going to stick around for another half hour or as long as it takes to see if there are any other questions. Again, thank you very much.